we have 4 out of the 5 countries in the world which still has the death penalty for crimes being committed below the age of 18. It's Iran, Yemen, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, some 6 weeks ago, a young man who had committed a crime below the age of 18 was executed in Iran. That had not, the sentences were keep coming from Iran, but for a few years there had been no execution, and 6 weeks ago a young man was executed. There's very little understanding and I would say sympathy on the part of the law enforcement agencies or the judiciary, but also of the public at large, of issues of diversion. How do you avoid children coming to court in the first place or coming in contact with the judiciary in my region? There's very little alternative to deprivation of liberty. The solution when a child commits a crime is put him behind bars.
In Mali, Niger, and Chad, more than 70% of girls are married before the age of 18. The issue of child marriage, teenage pregnancies, adolescent reproductive health hasn't really been addressed properly in the region, especially in the Sahelian countries. If I had some funds, I would establish an innovation fund. An innovation fund that would build up the evidence, that would do research, that would experiment, that would do pilots, and develop practical approaches that work. Because even if we had the resources, even if we had the capacities, we wouldn't really know what to do. Or we could do something, but we wouldn't be sure that it would have an impact. Critically, we would have to work together between child protection and health and the education sector. Because right now, the different initiatives are not linked. We all have a very, very strong stake, very strong interest in issues of violence and reproductive health of adolescent girls in the region, but we're not working together. I'm not just talking about UNICEF, but just in general, we don't see enough collaboration.
I work in the countries of the ex-Soviet blocs, and in these countries the tradition in social welfare was every time there was a problem to place the child into an institution. So if you have a child from a very poor family, the family cannot attend for the child, he is sent to an institution. You are a single mother, you have to work, there is no daycare centers, so the child is sent to an institution. You have a child with disability, born with disabilities, so the child is placed in an institution. And this practice has continued up to today. In the region, we have more than 1.3 million children placed into institutions. And it's a horrendous situation. 225,000 children with disabilities placed in institutional care without family visit, basically abandoned to the care of the state. And UNICEF is working with 22 countries in our region to change this, to bring a situation where proper social work and proper support will be provided to families to ensure that family separation will not be the only solution.
In some countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, UNICEF, in most cases, sometimes is the only agency that is present, especially on island in the Caribbean. And when I say that we have been able in birth registration to reduce under registration, we have to remember that each year, almost approximately 2 million children under 5 are not registered. And we have also evidence that those are the same children year after years that are not enregistered. They belong to a very specific group. They are indigenous children, they are Afro-descendant, they are migrant children, and they are those who live in the frontier area. But that does not stop there. Because in all the region, 90% of the country, a child without a birth certificate or without identification cannot sit on national exam. So cannot pass from primary to secondary, which means that the child has no other option than drop out.
And 1 in 5 children in Vietnam in secondary school have experienced some form of child abuse or neglect. A study of 6 provinces in China found that half the children surveyed had been victims of multiple forms of harm. Now, whilst these figures are fairly horrific and it's not something we want to happen, what is less well known is the damage that this does to children in their development, the long-term impact on brain development, the long-term ability to form relationships, their long-term cognitive thinking functions, so they drop out of school earlier, they're more likely to have irregular, low-skilled employment, they're less able to sustain relationships, they don't often have the capacity to actually have effective role modelling for care of children. They're much more likely to have multiple relationships and ending in marriage, and therefore we see a cycle of poverty and despair.
We're working in the biggest camp for over 400,000 people in Dadaab. I mean, you must have heard of Dadaab. We're working in Dolo Ado in Ethiopia. We're doing cross-border work. We follow these people as they're moving from Somalia into Kenya, and they are making tough decisions. Who becomes separated and being left behind, who's moving with their parents, who has to look after the old people and livestock. There's an issue of sexual violence. People don't recognize that in Somalia, but a lot of sexual violence goes on against the women because they're moving alone.
When we look at birth registration in the region, 64% of children don't have a birth certificate. And for Bangladesh, that figure in 2005 was 90%. So in 2005, 90% of children didn't have a birth certificate. But thanks to the efforts of UNICEF in our assistance to the government, we managed to reach in just a period of 4 or 5 years, more than 50% of children being registered.
Thanks to our intervention, our credibility of our intervention, we immediately put in place child-friendly spaces, for example, to occupy the children and make sure that the young boys, for example, will not join the rebellion and take up arms. The fact that we were able to monitor and report to the Security Council about what was going on with respect to violation against children, which add a strong political element, and this is all work done led by UNICEF with their partners. We are not alone, but led by UNICEF. One thing I just wanted to flag is that since we were able to go to Dr. Mustafa directly, I was able to advocate with him for some statement to be made by the leadership of the rebellion for them to ensure that no child, no youth will join the rank. I'm not saying that he was entirely successful, because we have all seen the picture on television of young boys wearing arms or uniform on both sides of the parties to the conflict. But they immediately issued some statement trying to instruct their military commander not to accept young boys in particular into the rank.